Welcome back to Keto and Krime and Thought Crime. Today I've got our book review. I have got a synopsis of the author of the book or the two authors of the book that set Alex Jones on his road to conspiracy, probably Bill Moore as well. It's Gary Allen and Larry Abraham's None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, and I will put a timestamp down below, a quick shout out to all my wonderful patrons and channel members. My channel members are Dr. D 𝗂𝐭𝐴𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿 Blame Lily, 𝗓𝗄𝗽, Joe Guitar, Katrina Middleton, Enigma X, Sherry Hendricks, Maybe Sunshine, Stephanie Mertz, and to my wonderful patrons, Roderick Hope, Mary Watt, Maybe Sunshine, Lori Holmes, Zachary Reese, Kimberly Jolly, Kat Whitlett, Lauren Kirk, Sarah Carney, Andrea Lee, Tabora Sumners Cooper, Demelza, Pasco, and Chloe. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join, Patreon's linked down below. Join button is right down below for subscribe, but the most important thing that you can do is subscribe to the channel. If I haven't earned your subscription, please go ahead and smash that subscribe button, hit that bell, hit that like button. Share, watch, comment. That's the most important thing you can do. I enjoy hanging out and talking about things that I think are interesting, which is true crime and weird history, which is why we are covering Alex Jones and what made him Alex Jones. I think that's interesting, and I hope you do too. And we're on the precipice of October, which means that my month of spooky true crime stories, true crime with a hint of mystery and supernatural, will be on tap, as well as 2 horror film commentaries with some of my good friends. So I hope that you enjoy that, and without further ado, let's get into it. First, we're going to go over the background of the 2 authors. First, Frederick D Allen. Let's get into it. Frederick D Allen was born August 2nd, 1936. He grew up in California, lived in California the majority of his life, and was a conservative writer, conspiracy theorist, and political pundit. So think of him as like a political talking head for his generation. That's what he did. And he attended Stanford University, which that definitely means he's either well-connected or very intelligent, and he majored in history. He then studied a few subjects at California State University in Long Beach, and became a prominent member of the John Birch Society, which we will also talk about. The John Birch Society is an ultra-conservative, right-wing think tank. It has been called let's just say it's been called a white conspiracy think tank, white supremacy. I can't prove or affirm that. I just know it is a conservative think tank that is still around. He was a spokesman for them, and he also wrote for their magazines, Conservative Digest and The American Opinion. He was a speechwriter for George Wallace during his brief run for the presidency in the 60s. For those of you who don't know, me being from Alabama, George Wallace is something that I can speak intelligently on. He was a racist. He was an asshole. But he did do some very good things for the state of Alabama, I have to admit, like establishing our community college system. So you have to give props where props are due, even though I think his views on race were the pits. He was the one that famously stood in the door to keep the University of Alabama from being integrated, which I think seals him in the world forever as being an asshole. But he also ran for president at one time in 1968 on the Dixiecrat ticket, which was kind of where the Democratic Party conservatives split off from the more liberal Democrats during the Civil Rights Movement and formed their own party. So he ran against Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon, of course coming in third, and did not get elected, thank goodness. And Gary Allen wrote his speeches for his presidential run. Among Allen's most well-known works is the 1971 book, 𝗠𝘂𝐿𝐼𝐿 conspiracy that we're going to review today, written with his co-writer, Larry Abraham. Allen would die in 1986 of liver failure in Long Beach, California. So let's talk about Larry Abraham, shall we? Larry Abraham was born October 29th, 1937. He is an American entrepreneur, businessman, and author, founder of Pan American Capital Group, and was a talking head on political, economic, and financial issues. Also a member of the John Birch Society, which is where he met Gary Allen. The book, 𝗠𝘂𝐿𝐼𝐿 Conspiracy, was written by them in 1971. During the 1972 presidential election, it sold over 1 million copies, which is unprecedented for a book, a paperback book in that era. The book even had a foreword by a popular conservative independent politician at the time, John George Schmitz. He was a Republican member of the House of Representatives from California, and a California state senator as well from Orange County, also a member of the John Birch Society. Which John Birch, as I said before, is a conservative think tank, anti-communism, pro-capitalism, has been called a white supremacy group, though I can't affirm or deny that. In 1972, Schmitz, who wrote the foreword for the book, was a candidate for President of the United States as an independent, and it was later known as the American Party, one of the many third parties that you can find still in existence. And he was definitely an interesting character. Schmitz, he did have a long, illustrious career in Congress. He was, as I said, very ultra-conservative, but probably one of the most damning things about him, he was a Holocaust denier. So keep that in mind as you listen to my review of this book. I'm not saying that Allen and Larry Abraham were, but the guy that wrote the foreword, which begins with a stark warning about complacency and allowing people to control you, was written by him, who was also a Holocaust denier. Where are all those Jews then? Idiot. It's probably why the John Birch Society actually kicked his ass out, which I think is funny. But anyway, so let's get back to the book. Okay, what is in 𝗠𝘂𝐿𝐼𝐿 conspiracy? Well, it's interesting. It mainly warns people against the evils of communism, but not communism as we think it is, which I think is one of the most interesting parts of the book. It really breaks it down. We will go over that. It mainly talks about how the power elite, and we're talking about politicians, the heads of major banks, especially international banks, as well as a lot of international corporations. You will recognize a lot of names that get mentioned in this book, as well as Hollywood celebrities, all the stuff you hear about the elites today. They're in this book. And it talks about how the government, these elites, in small increments, have controlled everything that has ever happened in history, and it's all leading up to the establishment of a new world order. And their main way of controlling us is through banking. For example, the income tax is a way of extorting money from the common man. The central bank, which makes loans to government entities, is a way of controlling governments. And then you turn around and have, these centralized banks holding all the national debt, again, control the government. And then how these banks were able to manipulate and actually cause the world wars, which we will also talk about. And so it's literally the foundation of most conspiracy theories that we think of, whether it be the Illuminati or, Power Elite or World Bank or anything. It can be linked to this book. And it was written by Larry Abraham, Gary Allen, with the foreword by Mr. Schmitz. So, without further ado, let's get into my analysis of 𝗠𝘂𝐿𝐼𝐿 conspiracy. Okay, to fully understand this book, we have to talk about Schmitz's foreword, which I said is a stark warning about complacency and trusting the government. He starts with saying to picture an artist that is painting a picture for you. And he says, what do you see when you think about government? You see them all saying the same thing. They want to stop, remember this is 1971. They want to stop communism. They want to stop crime. They want to stem the morality crisis that is plaguing our country and causing more looseness and a cesspool of evil to engulf the country. And they want to stem the debt. But he says, have you ever noticed how they don't do any of those things? And they simply continue with the policies of their predecessor, not doing anything about any of those. In fact, adding to the debt, and not doing anything about crime, not doing anything about anything, and yet they were condemning their predecessor all through their campaign, and this is directed at both parties, and yet they end up basically continuing on with what their predecessor was doing. And that struck a nerve because that happens a lot. And then he goes into two different theories on history, accidental and planned. Accidental is what is taught and touted, he said, in American education, American universities, and world universities and world school systems is an accidental version of history. How nothing was planned, outside of a few things, like somebody planned to build the city of Rome. Okay, we know that. But was Alexander the Great's invasion of the entire world pre-planned, or did he just do it? I mean, it was pre-planned to a certain extent, but what we're talking about is what they're talking about is how everything in history was, in the accidental view, was not planned. It just happened and the world went with it. Barring the micro planning that would have to take place in all of these scenarios. So that is the one that is taught. And then he talks about the planned theory of history, was that nothing has happened since the since the creation of modern man. Nothing has happened accidentally. It was all planned from soup to nuts, all planned, all for the ultimate goal of transforming us into a one world government. And he says, if you mention this in colleges or you mention this in school, it is ridiculed and you're called a crazy conspiracy theorist. But in this book, they lean toward that definition of history, how everything was planned out. And planned out by a group of very few people, which you're going to recognize a lot of the names. And so he says that this book will be a summary of the previous 6 presidential administrations. So, and I actually looked this up, 1971 is when this was written. So we have to assume he's talking about FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and finally Nixon, who was president when this book came out. So he then goes into talking about what he calls poison ivy, or university education, and how they are brainwashing everyone to believe in the accidental version of the accidental theory of history, that they tout ignorance and that history is not what you think because the winners of wars write the history, and that's absolutely true. They do. But I don't know what to say about that. That is kind of a scary thought. But, the winners do write the history, so it may or may not be the truth, I suppose, and that is food for thought. I'm just glad that we do have the internet right now where you can look up stuff, but who's authoring stuff on... See, this is why you need to be strong when you read these kind of books, because they can get in. They got into my head. Like I said, I had hairs on the back of my neck standing up when I read some of this. So, and some of it, like I said, there's enough truth in most conspiracy that it'll really make you think. All right. And then he goes on again to talk about how this type of history education is a play, and everything is to make you think that everything is by accident, nothing is planned. And then how they ridicule people that talk about the planned theory of history as kooky conspiracy theorists, right-wing extremists, and he admits that some do go off the rails with it, but you're not too far from the truth if you think that this could and is happening. And this is the Holocaust denier writing this, remember, the forward. Schmitz didn't believe the Holocaust happened. Whatever. All right, then he goes into touting how everyone is tracked from birth with a social security number, how that was all planned from the beginning, and how it's going to get worse. And then he talked about mainstream media. Oh my God, so much of this is like right on, you know, just it's current topics. Either people don't change all that much or they were on to something. I would really like to think that it's just that people don't change. And then he talks about how the media is the purveyor of everything. They are really the one that push this accidental theory of history and how they've covered up many, many things in history. He talks about like FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had polio so bad in his second term or third term that he couldn't walk. Yet he was seen on media walking with the help of two aides on either side, and how the media covered that up. I truly believe, and that's a fact, but I also, rather than believing that it's like some evil conspiracy to keep us from the truth, I think it was maybe just the respect that the media had for our government leaders during a World War situation, and that maybe because he had to be strong, that they didn't want to, you know, make the American people even. I mean, this is the man that was giving the fireside chats that says you have nothing to fear but fear itself. So, but yet he couldn't walk. So how would that reign with the American public? I think the media felt it was in the public's best interest to have them recognize FDR as a strong person. I think it was just the respect that the media had. Oh, have we have changed? Oh my God. So anyway, I think that's more where it was coming from, but he uses it to say that, okay, they are lying to us. Then he talks, and then the forward does end, and then we actually get into the actual meat of the book. And it begins with the stories of Hitler and Lenin, saying that they were both born unprivileged, fairly unprivileged, you know, middle class. They both wrote down their plans for domination while in prison, and how easy it would be for an elite person in a position of power to be planning this even today, just like Lenin and just like Hitler. He alludes to the fact that their rise to power were planned by the elites. That Hitler's rise to power was completely planned, as was Lenin's, and then also into Stalin. So all of this was just a way to begin the process. So we're beginning with Hitler and Stalin, or Hitler and Lenin, and how this was part of the grand plan to enslave the world under one big monarchy. So why Hitler and why Stalin? Let's talk about that. Now, I have some thoughts on that. So let's look at Hitler. Let's look at Hitler and Lenin, since they were kind of going through their transition almost the same time. You know, Hitler was born in the 1800s. He did serve in the German army under the Kaiser in World War I. After the end of World War I, the Kaiser was deposed, and Germany was under the Weimar Republic, which wasn't doing a very good job. There was hyperinflation. There was no jobs. They had been basically forced into signing a treaty that would suck them dry for many, many years to come. And so they were in a depression. And as a result, Hitler and his Nazi party, who promised, you know, Germany first, you know, jobs for Germany, rose to power pretty easily. Now, I think that, to me, that aligns more on accidental empowerment, just that Hitler was able to capitalize on what was going on, the political unrest and the political evil, to do what he did, rather than some global conspiracy that caused World War I and caused the decline of Germany. I mean, I know people can't keep secrets for shit. So I don't think that this conspiracy could last for this many years with no one knowing about it. I mean, okay, these crazy conspiracy theorists know about it. But if this was really a conspiracy, wouldn't they kill him? And I guess you could go back to, well, maybe they allow them to live so nobody will believe the conspiracy. There's always a what if. But I am a lot more inclined to believe that Hitler's rise to power was just it was just the happenstance. He capitalized on a weak point in German history. The same could be said for a lot of different people. Look at Lenin. Lenin was also born in the 1800s. He was a studier of the works of Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto. He came to be a kind of a rabble-rouser, a protest leader, which got him jailed by Tsar Nicholas II a couple of times, and then would eventually be freed. And then the Germans would actually fund Lenin to go in and essentially cause the Bolshevik Revolution, which helped them defeat Russia during World War I and allowed then the Bolsheviks to kill the Tsar and take over. So I'm a little more inclined to believe that Lenin's rise to power might have been planned by the Germans to win the war. That's a little more of what I consider a micro manipulation. But I don't think that there was any diabolical plan in Hitler's rise to power, if that makes sense. So anyway, and then he goes on to say that he's interviewed 6 highly placed military officers that will, concur with what he says. And then he goes on to talk about current day, 1972, that Americans are consumed with anti-communism. This is 20 years, post-McCarthy, where they actually put people on federal trial for suspicion of being a communist. But then he goes on to say that no one really knows what communism is, that no one can really define it. There is many people, he said, that if you ask, they will say it is Russian imperialism rebirth. So it's the rejoining of the Russian Empire to bring back the Tsar. That's communism. Then people will say it's Marxism, which is probably the most well-known, the Marxist theory of everything belonging to the people and equality of people, but yet that always seems to fall under some authoritarian type of government. Then there's the economic theory, to each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And then there's just radical socialism, which is basically, but even Stalin and Lenin said that socialism, the goal of socialism is communism. So there you go. And then he says, if you look at every different communist regime around the world, he mentioned Castro in Cuba, he mentioned Mao in China, he mentioned Pol Pot in Cambodia. He says every single one of these proclaimed to be the leader of a communist regime, yet they all do it differently. And the Soviet Union was very different than any of these other places, that how no one can really put their finger on communism. And then he goes, that's why these elites are so dangerous, because they have everybody warring against communism, but nobody knows what communism is. And he said in this book, they're going to go off the theory that it is a push to unite the world under one authoritarian government to control the entire globe. And he says this happens in several different ways. And then he goes into talking about something called money manipulators, and how literally the control of money will control governments. And I can see how this is true. He talks about the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and when I actually delved into these organizations, they were all created around the same time. They're a family of 5 different international organizations that actually lend money to third world governments to help them defeat poverty and get into the first world, basically. So yeah, these are international banking firms that are supported by first world countries that help third world countries, but then hold these countries' national debts and can control them. Again, hair stood up on the back of my head. The World Bank is usually presided over by an American, and then the International Monetary Fund itself is based in Washington, D.C. and that people worldwide, countries worldwide, depend on the World Bank and the IMF for loans to actually make their government go. So that's one way that money manipulates everything. The other is what he calls international banking firms, and then he goes into telling us about the Rothschilds of France, who are also the Rothschilds of England, the Rothschilds of Germany, and it's a huge international banking conglomerate ran by a Jewish family. This is kind of where the whole Jewish control the banking system theory comes from. And so he talks about their hand in so many historical events. These Rothschilds have used Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto to enslave countries for years and prepare their people for ultimate control. The very thing they inspire people to war against, they are using, and they are using it by virtue of what they call the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. And this is how you prepare a country for this version of communism and then essentially world domination. So let's see what those 10 planks are, shall we? First is the abolition of property and property rights and property ownership, where the government basically controls all the land and allows the people to live on it for a price. This is kind of what is happening, what happens in Germany, where you were not allowed, I mean, not Germany, but China. My apologies to the German people. China, you are not allowed to own land in China. You can only lease it for 75 years. That's the reason a lot of Chinese investors buy American property, which is a whole other different problem. And then they go on to talk about how zoning laws and the government telling you what you can and can't build in certain areas is preparing us for the abolition of property rights. I'm not sure what to think about that. I think zoning laws are good to a certain extent because you don't want a titty bar next to a school. I think that's a good idea. But I see that some of them can get out of hand. A heavily progressive tax. They say that taxing you more, the more you make, is preparing you for giving all of your income to the government. I am a proponent of a flat tax. I think a flat tax is much more. I think it should just be 15, 20, 25% across the board. That's what you pay. No deductions. Get rid of the IRS, but I'm not getting into all of that. But they say a progressive tax is preparing you to give all your money away. Abolition of the rights of inheritance, which will go along to property rights, and they say that death and real estate and estate taxes are part of this. Confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels, and hint how the police can seize your property when you're arrested for a crime, not even convicted of a crime, but arrested for a crime. Freeze your bank account, seize your home, blah, blah, blah. I think that should be abolished. And then by controlling by controlling all the credit, hence the Federal Reserve, paper money, reserve banking, and then the centralization of the means of communications. They're talking about the FCC, Department of Transportation. Equal liability of all labor, which means that certain trade partners have a most favored nation status, and they say, why are we so heavily partnered with communists? Like China is our most favored nation. And then the combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, so that the government can control everything. And then finally, the one that really made the hair stand up on the back of my head, free education, abolition of child labor, which I think that's a good thing. And then a completely government-run education system which teaches them the accidental theory of history, and also kind of turns them into little activists. And we do see that happening quite a bit with some of the public school systems, though we are, fighting back. There are charter schools, there are private schools. I'm all about choice in education. Again, not only, it's kind of hard not to get political when you're covering something like this, but I don't think we are completely beholden to the government for our education. We have way too many options, but that's what they're saying. Remember, this was written in 1972. And then they talk about how the income tax was our first step on the way to this, and how that a many international banking, like the Rothschilds and other international banking families pushed for the end of the Russian Tsar Nicholas, and which helped set Lenin up for the Bolshevik Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union, which they say is the model for the one world government. Now, I will say that I believe Lenin was funded by the Germans in an effort to help them win the war against Russia. But do I believe it was a big international conspiracy? No, I don't, because I don't know. I just don't. I don't think that this could be kept secret. And also the Soviet Union fell. So ultimately it failed. So, you know, we were still in the midst of the Cold War, or even the beginnings of the Cold War at this time. So I can understand how they would say that the Soviet Union is the plan for us all, but the Soviet Union no longer exists. And then they talk about Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, and how the League of Nations and the United Nations pushed us even closer, and how that the Rothschilds, together with the Rockefellers, another international business conglomerate that controls everything, helped bring about World War II so that they could get the League of Nations and the United Nations confirmed, and so that there would be things like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which was, you know, for the longest time during the Cold War, was all the communist nations together with the Soviet Union. So it would get the world ready for these, like, these were regional governments that were getting the world ready for one world government. But again, Warsaw Pact no longer exists. Soviet Union no longer exists. Many of those countries that were beholden to the Soviet Union are now free and independent. They talk about how East Germany, but you know, East Germany is now reunited, thank goodness. So a lot of this gets lost between 1972 and today because they don't know what we know now. And then they talk about how these conglomerates actually took over the media, and how your media is only owned by 2 or 3 different companies. And if you look at it, yeah, I think we have maybe 10 media companies that control all the media in the world. That's scary, which is why I like to get my news from independent journalists. And I think everyone should, to get a balanced approach, because they are very political in what they feed us. And then they talk about, of course, conservatives disguised as liberals that are trying to bring down conservatism. Like I said, these are ultra right-wing people. And then the final part of the book just goes in, it's a pretty short book. The final part of the book goes into how it's up to the common person to stop this and don't let them call you crazy. And I can see how this would have electrified so many of the modern conspiracy theorists that we know, like Alex Jones. I really think that this was just the perfect storm. And if I can imagine reading this as a teenager, and, you know, it being in the early 90s and not everything, you know, the Berlin Wall just fell. The Soviet Union just collapsed. So not quite seeing it the way we see it through the lens of history. So I can really see how this book could have electrified Alex Jones. I also think it's a fun read. It's a good read. Some of it does still ring true today. I think having monopolies on things like media and other things that we consume for our news is dangerous. I think any kind of monopoly on education, I think there should be a good balance of public and private education, religious and secular. I don't think there should be one monopoly, because then you can't control what the next generation believes. Anyway, and none dare call it conspiracy. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back soon with another video. And until next time, Keto Krime.